Welcome to the Orca Month Book Club, co-hosted by myself, Whitney Neugebauer of Whale Scout, and Colleen Weiler, the Jessica Ricos Fellow with Whale and Dolphin Conservation. How's it going out there on the Oregon coast, Colleen?
It's good. It's a beautiful day outside, nice and sunny.
Excellent. It
Yeah.
as well here in Seattle. This is pre-recorded, so hopefully it's still sunny the day that we post this. I'm sure it will be. It's a beautiful June Orca month. Today we are really lucky to have with us the author of Endangered Orcas, The Story of the Southern Residents. That is Monika Wieland Shields from Friday Harbor. Welcome, Monika. Glad to talk to you again.
Hi, yeah, nice to see you both.
Yes, well, welcome. This was fantastic reading your book as part of this this three-book Orca Month book club. I love your book because out of the ones that we read, of course, it follows most closely the southern resident killer whales, and it's also one of the most current books as well. Sort of leads you right up to the current hot issues that we are dealing with southern resident killer whales. The book is divided into three parts. The first is on orca biology. The second part is on our relationship to orcas. And the third part is a deep dive into their threats. Monika, can you tell us a little bit about this book and what the writing process was like for you and how you got started?
Yeah, so I was really inspired by Eric Hoyt's book, Orca, the Whale Called Killer. It was one of the first whale books that I read when I was a teenager. And I loved how he kind of blended the stories of the humans with the stories of the whales and the latest science of what was known at the time, and really told a compelling story about the whole region and about our shifting relationship with killer whales in his book throughout mainly the capture era and kind of the beginning of whale research. And as the years and decades went by since he had written his book, I remained surprised that there was not a similar book that had a focus on the southern residents and everything that was going on with them since the live capture era. So Eric's book really focused primarily on the northern residents, and I felt like the story, there was a lot more to be told. And eventually, when nobody else was writing that book, I kind of realized, well, maybe I should give it a shot. And it originally started as a writing project with myself and three other women, and life kind of happened, and we had held some writers' workshops and stuff over some pieces we were writing, but one by one, people kind of had to drop out of the project, and I still felt really strongly that it needed to happen. So that's kind of how the whole project got started.
In the book, you talk about growing up in Portland, Oregon, and seeing the whales at SeaWorld, and then finally the orcas in Alaska. What inspired you to start writing? Did it start with I know you're also very much into blogging. Did it also start with blogging?
Yeah, for sure. I've been a writer and a whale lover from a very young age. My mom recently dug out something I wrote in the first grade. It was a story about my mom befriending a killer whale. So my history of writing in whales goes way back to at least the age of 7. And as you mentioned, I saw killer whales in the wild for the first time in Alaska, but then learned about the southern residents who were a little bit closer to home and easier to visit from Portland. And as I started spending more and more time up here, I did start my blog, and the main reason for that was to share both the photos and the stories of some of the encounters that I was having with people. Because I didn't really have another outlet at that point in time to share a lot of the things I was experiencing. And I'm so glad that I started that blog when I did, because some of my early blog posts actually worked themselves into my book and were kind of some of those detailed, first-person encounters of whale experiences that I had documented on my blog, and they ended up in my book as well.
It's a good transition from blog writing into book writing. And, you mentioned having this love for orcas and for whales at a very young age and visiting the southern residents specifically because they were close to home. But it seems for a lot of researchers, especially with the southern resident orcas, it kind of starts with they see them in the wild first, and you just fall in love from there. And so you mentioned, your whole life kind of centers around these whales in the book. Can you describe a little bit more what you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, my first encounter with the southern residents was after I had convinced my parents to take us on a summer vacation up here. I think I was 13 or 14 at the time. And it was absolutely love at first sight with the southern residents, as much as it was with just killer whales in general. And as I got the opportunity to spend more time here, I got an internship at the Whale Museum, and I interned with Bob Otis out at Limekiln Lighthouse. And as I got into college, I still spent summers up here working as a naturalist on a whale watch vessel. And I just knew that this was the place that I wanted to be. I wanted to spend as much time with these whales as possible, and San Juan Island was a perfect point for that, being one of the best places to watch killer whales in the world, especially from shore, on the west side of San Juan Island especially. And so that was sort of my main goal going through high school and college, was that I wanted to end up on San Juan Island. And that's sort of, the rest of my life kind of built itself around that. I have another job here on the island that's not whale related. And, I have a husband and we own a house here, and all the pieces kind of fell into place to complete my life. But the first piece I knew that I wanted to be a central part of my adult life was the southern residents in San Juan Island.
The theme for Orca Month this June is Orca love. Can you nail down exactly what it is about orcas that is just so important to you?
Oh, it's hard to pinpoint. And people ask me sometimes too, like, why are orcas so much more magnetic than any other species, it seems like. And it's hard to say. There's something, I think, that's so charismatic about them. Of course, they're visually striking with tall dorsal fins and bold black and white coloration. So they immediately grab our visual attention. And I think just watching them move through their environment, interact with one another, and then, of course, those of us who are lucky enough to kind of follow their stories over time, we really recognize so much of ourselves in them, and so much of the social complexity and culture and life history. Yet at the same time, they're living in this environment that's completely foreign to us as humans. So we recognize kind of some of these social and cultural similarities, yet they're, primarily acoustic creatures, whereas we're primarily visual. They're, of course, living underwater. We're terrestrial. So it's this interesting combination of similarities and stark differences. And I think that's just incredibly intriguing to us.
That's very true. I find that connection really interesting too, like how many parallels there are between our own culture and theirs, which is one of the big draws, I think, of the southern residents. Monika, you mentioned, we've talked about you were a blogger, you've been a naturalist, you've kind of done all of these different roles relating to San Juan Island and being with the southern resident orcas. And especially with this book, and this is something we talked about with Eric Hoyt as well, you kind of bring in both fields of science and conservation. So how do you balance kind of being a scientist with being a conservationist or an advocate for the recovery of this endangered population?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of my initial interest in the whales, I would say was more purely scientific, where I wanted to know what they were communicating about and how they communicate, and kind of these intriguing questions that maybe didn't tie in directly to conservation. But especially when you're working with an endangered species, you can't separate the two. And I think as scientists, we don't really have the luxury of just collecting data and asking interesting questions. I think we really have the responsibility of advocating for the species that we're studying, whether it be for their preservation or their recovery or whatever it is. And with the southern residents, when I first started seeing them, they hadn't been listed as endangered yet back in the early 2000s. But watching, the endangered listing happen and then the continued population decline over the last 20 years, and there's no way that you can stay silent on something like that, especially when it's happening to a species and a population and individuals that you have so much love for. And we're kind of trained, right, to separate the hard data from our emotions, and sometimes even from advocacy and policy making and lobbying efforts and stuff like that. But when it comes to the southern residents, I don't think we can really do that. Most of the scientists, including myself, got into the work that we're doing because we love the whales so much and we have those powerful emotional connections to them. And they're in trouble, and we need to do our part to collect the facts and share the data and present the information in ways that can help towards their recovery.
So I mentioned that we're reading two other books, and Eric Hoyt's is one of them. The other one is Listening to Whales by Alexandra Morton. And between the three of you authors, a similarity is that you all took an initial interest in acoustics. And, nowadays you just don't hear as much about acoustics research unless it's related to vessel noise and disturbance. So what drove you initially into being curious about acoustics? And do you think that there is still a future for acoustics research, or are there questions that still remain regarding the southern resident killer whales?
Yeah, if anyone who's listened to the whales on the hydrophone or heard them over a speaker on a whale watch boat or at limestone, you're immediately intrigued by their vocalizations, just like you're intrigued by seeing them. The southern residents are very chatty whales, even compared to other killer whale populations, and they just make so many interesting and dynamic and sometimes humorous noises that it just begs the question, what are they talking about all the time? And then the fact that they have these stereotyped vocalizations that are consistent, over 50 plus years, yet also these variable calls that they kind of make once and not again. And yeah, it just begs the question, what are they communicating about? How are they communicating? And that was just one of the first things that hooked me about them. And so that was kind of where my early research interest went. And you're absolutely right that a lot of the acoustics research that we hear about now is so focused on vessel noise and the impact of underwater noise on southern residents, which is really key, of course, in their conservation efforts to understand how that's impacting them, and especially their ability to forage. But there's such a wide world of questions still to ask and to be answered about southern resident killer whale communication. And I'm really excited to get back into some of that. Our intern this spring is actually working on a project on whistles and what role they play among southern resident communication. And she's made some really interesting findings. So we actually hope to publish a paper later this year about whistles in southern residents, which is sort of a less talked about vocalization for them. So there's definitely still more that we don't know than what we do know about southern resident communication, and lots of interesting questions to be asked going forward.
Yeah, there are a ton of questions around communication, and that's really exciting to hear there's a new paper coming out about it. I'm looking forward to reading it. I feel like there hasn't been a publication around their communication in a while, so that'll be great. Communication and like those whistles and stereotyped calls are one of the things that we point to when we talk about culture and, learned things that are passed down in the southern resident community. What are some of the other examples of possible clues or information about that culture that you've seen?
Yeah, acoustics are definitely one of the more well-documented forms of culture, and maybe in the scientific world, one of the more kind of acceptable forms of culture, because the acceptance of culture in other species is still fairly new, and the learned communication skills and call types that are kind of passed on is one clear example of that. But really, like the behavioral differences we see between the different ecotypes and the dietary specialization that we see is purely cultural as well. We know that southern residents are capable of killing marine mammals. We see them harass and sometimes kill porpoises, but not consume them. So physically, they're capable of eating marine mammals, but they choose not to. And that all comes back to their culture. And really the food that they eat is so central to who they are, that their whole social system of being able to be in big gregarious groups, unlike the transients or big killer whales, the fact that they are so chatty, vocal, active at the surface, all aspects of their culture kind of surround the fact that they eat prey and what that allows them to do or not to do in their environment. So prey is the big one, but we see lots of other interesting behaviors as well, like kelping and swimming through the kelp beds on the west side of San Juan Island, or when they come by a floating piece of kelp. That's something not all killer whale populations do, but the southern residents seem to have a particular preference for it, similar to the beach rubbing among the northern residents. And then we see other little games or fads that kind of appear for short periods of time that are examples of culture. There was a time when there was a fad among the southern residents to balance pieces of driftwood on their head for a summer. I heard about one that unfortunately I didn't get to see, but where they dragged pieces of kelp underwater and would let them go until they came up to the surface and kind of leaped into the air. And they did that for one summer. So there's kind of the fun and games aspect of their culture as well.
Those are two examples I had never heard before reading your book, the driftwood and the kelp. So I was excited to hear that.
Yeah, they definitely have a playful side, and it's really cool to see that they have these little things that they kind of innovate, and they're fun for a while, and then they get bored of them and move on to something else. Another similarity to humans in that regard.
Could you share with us some of the most exciting and perplexing sometimes stories that you've experienced with the whales over the years? Like, what are some of your favorites?
Well, definitely my most memorable one, and one that I keep returning to, comes back to acoustics again. And this is another story I tell in my book of being out at Limekiln on a summer evening and having the L12 subgroup passing by. And most of the whales were maybe half a mile or more offshore. And one whale in particular broke off from the group, came right over to where there were people on the rocks at Limekiln, the only place on the shoreline where there were people, and lifted their head up out of the water, and they were vocalizing into the air right to us on shore at Limekiln. And a friend got a video recording of it. We were making a hydrophone recording at the time, and the whale was repeating the same vocalization in the air and underwater, and kept going for maybe 3 or 4 minutes, which is a pretty long time for a whale to just stay at the surface in one spot. And then eventually just dove and went back out and rejoined his family. And later we were able to determine through matching the eye patch that it was L85 Mystery, who was a juvenile male at the time. And so appropriate that his name is Mystery, because that remains one of my most mysterious encounters of why did the whale do that? Why did he come over right to where we were? Why was he vocalizing? What was he trying to communicate? And there are just so many moments like that that are unexpected and unexplainable, and we just kind of have to hold on to those and see if they might make some more sense over time as we learn more about what these whales and what they're doing. But that was one of my most intriguing encounters for sure.
Stories like that are almost, too incredible to believe they actually happened, are kind of a recurring theme in these books about orcas, where it's about, people's personal experiences with them. So would you say that incident with Mystery is your best experience with the whales, or do you have another that would rank as number one?
Well, that's so hard. There's so many encounters, and my parents ask me sometimes, like, don't you ever get tired of seeing the whales? You see them so many times. But no, I never do. And it's because every encounter is different. It's hard to pick favorites, but if I had to put a number one, it would probably be the first time that I saw J41 Eclipse. She's my personal favorite, and I saw her when she was maybe just 2 days old, still had fetal folds, of the very pink little baby, and I say she was the smallest killer whale that I've ever seen, and that's still true. And it was one of those beautiful, glassy, calm mornings at Limekiln with sky blue water, and All of J-Pod came through very close to shore, and it was my first time meeting little baby eclipse, and it was super memorable and super beautiful. I took some of my favorite whale photos I've ever taken during that encounter. So if I had to pick a number one, it would probably be that one.
Well, along with some of the most amazing experiences with these whales comes a dark side. And in your book, you talk about some of the politics that are surrounding the whale community. Could you explain, first why you chose to include that in your book, and what do you think we can learn from this complicated history?
Yeah, a lot of people wonder why I included that in my book. A lot of people have actually given me feedback that was their favorite part of my book. The reason I felt so strongly that it needed to be included was because I did more than 30 interviews in the process of writing this book. And in every single interview, whether I brought it up or not, the topic of whale politics came up. And there's something, about the whales that kind of brings out the best in us. And then also something that can unfortunately almost bring out the worst in us. And it's sort of this competitive nature of wanting to be the first or wanting to see the most, and then wanting kind of ownership of your data, and there's just this history of some pretty nasty things that we've done to one another. We're all people that love the whales, but we haven't always treated one another with a lot of respect around when it comes to sharing our experiences with the whales. And unfortunately, that's really affected the history of us and our relationship to the whales, and I think in some sense also stands in the way of our collaboration towards their recovery at times, which is really unfortunate. But the truth of the matter is that it's a part of the story. It's a part of how we relate to them and how we got to where we are today. So I thought it was really important that be told.
I'm glad to hear the initial feedback on including that has been pretty positive and that people appreciate that it's being discussed. Has there been any other feedback or reactions to the book when we're about a year out from it being published?
Yeah, the feedback has been amazing. It's been overwhelming, really, and so great to hear. Some feedback on the politics part before it actually got published was I ended up self-publishing the book, but I originally had a publishing deal in place, and that was actually a point of contention between myself and the publisher. Was they felt that section was maybe too gossipy and didn't really warrant inclusion because it kind of got a little bit away from the whales. But since I ended up going the self-publishing route and got to include that, again, the feedback that I've received from people was really encouraging that it was the right choice to include. And what I've heard from people on the book in general is exactly the sentiment that I had, was a gratitude that I wrote this book because it was kind of missing. We didn't have the sort of Eric Hoyt version of the book for the Southern residents, and that was my goal, that if somebody is new to this story, there's so much information out there about the Southern residents, but there's not really any piece of work that's an introductory piece that can sort of give people an overview of the history and the complications and all the factors involved, yet also hopefully summarizes some of the latest information and tells a lot of stories that maybe not everybody has heard before. So it's interesting, I hope, and that's what I've heard, to people new to the whales and also veterans of the whale community, and that's been a real honor to hear.
Well, one of the things that I've heard from people when they're talking about your book is that they are really appreciative of the fact that at the end of each chapter, you give a section, a little blurb about more information. And if you want to learn more, where to find those resources. So that's one piece of feedback that I've heard from people. Are there other ways that you think that people should stay informed and engaged in this issue?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something a lot of people have told me as well. And I felt so strongly that I needed to have a way to point out all these other amazing resources that are out there on these specific topics that I kind of touch on in my book, but didn't have the space to go into, as much detail. So if there's specific pieces that people really want to do a deeper dive on, I was really glad to be able to point them to some of the resources that I relied on and that I continue to rely on to learn the latest information about some of these topics. In terms of staying engaged, there's a lot of groups that are following the story of the Southern residents. So there are many places on social media you can connect in to learn about action alerts and kind of the latest news. Both we at the Orca Behavior Institute and Whitney, you at Whale Scout, we've been part of this kind of informal team BOLD that has put out these action alerts and tried to digest some of the information out there in public comment periods to let people know, when their voice is needed and what some of the beneficial places where the public can engage in. So there's a lot of ways to plug in. Of course, there's sightings pages like Orca Network where people can hear the latest information about when and where the whales have been seen. There's a lot of information out there, and people that want to engage more actively, I often send them to your direction at Whale Scout because you guys are doing so much to connect the whales to the much needed salmon restoration in the region. So lots of great ways to connect. No matter where you live in the Salish Sea, there's probably one or multiple organizations nearby that you can connect with.
Those resources for like continued information are so important because I think the only drawback of a book is that it's finite in time. It's published and then you can't keep updating it. So your book did come out about a year ago, and there's been some changes with the whales and with recovery efforts since then. But similar to Eric's book and going back to those connections, you included an epilogue about the future for the whales. So in that year timeline, have your thoughts on that future or, what you would put in that epilogue now, have those changed?
I don't think so. I was working on the book off and on for a long time and was sort of struggling with when is the right time to release it for exactly that reason you mentioned, that there's always things happening. So their story isn't done, but at some point the book had to be done. And after the summer of 2018, when Tahlequah carried her calf for 17 days, when we had the whole saga with Scarlet looking malnourished and the potential intervention efforts for her, that definitely felt like everything was coming to a head alongside the Orca task force and everything. That was like kind of a peak in attention to the whales and on this new focus to recovery efforts. And it's not necessarily that things have declined since then. I think that attention and those efforts have been maintained, but that seemed like a real turning point of a year. And so I'm really glad that I published the book when I did. I think my message, still stays the same as what I wrote in the epilogue. I don't think anything too dramatic has shifted in the last year.
Well, I'll give another plug out there. If you live in Oregon and you want to stay engaged in Oregon, that Colleen with Whale and Dolphin Conservation is always, doing outreach events and also putting out action alerts and keeping all of Oregon, which is a territory of the southern resident killer whales, engaged. So thank you for that, Colleen. Monika, the book is just amazing. I recommend it to everyone. Where can people buy the book and learn more?
Yeah, it is available online. You can go to indybound.org and have it ordered directly to your local bookstore, no matter where you live. So you can support your local independent bookstore, get a copy of the book, and have it shipped directly to you wherever you are. So pretty great service at indybound.org.
And Monika, you mentioned also the Orca Behavior Institute, which is now what you're putting a lot of your time and energy into. Can you give us a little more information about OBI?
Yeah, so we started in 2015, and just like the book was kind of an outlet for some of my writing and photography work, I felt like I was kind of missing that connection to the whale research after having graduated from college. And the Orca Behavior Institute was started by a small group of us here on San Juan Island with a focus of conducting non-invasive behavioral and acoustic research on both the southern resident and the transient killer whales here in the Salish Sea. And our first focus over these first 5+ years or so has really been to document some of the long-term changes that have been going on. There's a lot of great data sets out there, going back to the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s. And one thing that we've noticed, those of us who have been watching these whales over the last 10 or 20 years, is that there's been a lot of shifts in how they're using their habitat, both among the southern residents and among the mammal-eating transient killer whales. And we really set out to collect some of that data, compile some of that data, and document in the peer-reviewed literature some of these trends that those of us living here had noticed, but maybe hadn't kind of gotten out of that bubble into the realm of the documented literature, where it can hopefully help inform policy going forward. Now that we've published kind of a sightings update paper on both populations, the southern residents and the West Coast transients, we are turning to some of our other research questions, including, like I mentioned, the whistle communication. We're also working on some behavioral budget studies of the southern residents and how they spend their time when they're here compared to historically. So we've got a lot of different partners that we're working with to collect and compile data, and we're out in the field ourselves having whale encounters as well. And trying to, just collect data, share it with the public, and share it with the policymakers, hoping that it can, provide insights on not just what has happened before, but what is happening now and what's changing in the Salish Sea with whales.
Speaking of those changes and those shifts from, historic behavior or precedent, you talk about in the book how every time we think that we've figured something out about the whales, they do something different that has to change our perspective. So what's been the biggest surprise to you, or the biggest change as you're observing the whales and their behavior and collecting some of this scientific information?
Yeah, when people ask me my favorite fact about orcas, that's almost what I say, is that there are no hard facts, because there's always an exception, it seems like, to every rule. I think one of the most surprising things that we've learned recently is about individuals maybe not staying with their pod for their entire life. Like, of course, we documented, L87 and switching from L pod to K pod to J pod, but then learning from others' work, like with the genetic studies, that possibly, J1 Ruffles was not Granny's son, as was long hypothesized, but actually appears to be the son of an L-pod whale, and may have been another whale that switched pods permanently. So things like that, where we say, they stay with their mothers and in their family group for their entire lives. And, well, most of them do, but not all of them. And what triggers those exceptions? Why is L87's story different? Why was J1's story different? Was so interesting to think about. And I think those exceptions are always when we gain maybe a little bit more insight, or at least figure out what questions we should be asking going forward to learn just a little bit more about these whales.
That'll be in the second edition in 5 years.
Oh, 5 years, is that all I have? Figure that out.
Oh, we'll be waiting for you, Monika. Anytime that you're ready, we'll be ready. So again, you can buy the book at IndieBound, your local bookstores. I got my copy on Amazon. I want to thank you so much, Monika, for coming on and chatting with us. Thank you so much. Good luck with OBI. And again, this is part of the Orca Month Book Club. If you want to learn more about the books we've been reading, you can go up to whalescout.org, look in the podcast sections. We're also on iTunes, and now with video on our YouTube channel. Just search Whale Scout in the youtube.com. You can also learn more about Orca Month and all of our virtual events that are happening this June at orcamonth.com. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.